With the release of the EOS R5 Mark II and R1, Canon has made a subtle but important to understand change to how evaluative metering works. The change is controlled by a new setting called Detect Priority AE with AF, and it's found on page 2 of the Shoot menu. In the manual, Canon describes the Detect Priority AE with AF setting as performing metering for the subject based on the AF subject to detect setting. However, further down the page, they also describe the function when enabled as metering is based on the AF point or AF area where the subject was detected. Now, in practice, neither of these descriptions are completely complete or even quite right in some ways, though it's not clear to me if the simplification in the manual was a product of the writers not knowing or understanding the full extent of the changes, or if this is merely a matter of simplifying the manual text to make it more approachable for more people instead of being completely correct. Now, before we get to looking at what's actually going on, let's quickly touch on the subject and limitations of this function. The Detect Priority AE with AF setting is found on the bottom of the exposure page, or page 2, in the red shooting menu in photo mode. It's also available in movie mode, where it's found again on the exposure page. This time it's page 3 of the red shooting menu section as well. Now, in either case, the options are simple. Either enable the default or disable the other option are all of your choices. Now, as for limitations, to start with, Detect Priority AE with AF is unavailable when the metering mode is set to something other than evaluative, and the menu will be disabled to reflect this. Further, even if enabled, metering prioritization will not be used if your lens is in manual focus mode. This includes even if you're using a compatible autofocus lens, like an RF mount Canon lens, and have the focus guide function enabled, which does actually use the lens's AF feedback system to measure focus. Finally, even though setting the AF subject to detect setting to none doesn't actually disable this menu entry, the metering biasing isn't supposed to function. However, in my testing, I found at least small differences in metering results, around a third of a stop in an extremely high contrast scene, even when the AF subject to detect was set to none when this was enabled or disabled. Now, that said, in more typical applications like regular kinds of scenes and not something super high contrast, I don't expect this to be a practical difference in that case. Now, for the demonstrations that we're going to look at in this video, I've set up a very high contrast situation. And honestly, this is probably not going to be the most common situation you'll see in normal shooting. I have my standard black textured photographic background that is also largely shaded from any direct light to create a maximally black background. Put in front of that a high contrast white target, and we have a high contrast, or me for that matter, and we have a high contrast scenario that is going to push the camera's metering algorithms to their limits and create the largest obvious changes that we can have to illustrate what's going on. Now, that said, again, in more realistic situations with more realistic contrast levels, I would expect to see changes in metering based on this function setting, but I would not expect to see them to be anywhere near as significant as what I'm showing in this video to clearly demonstrate what's going on. So in my first test here, I've set the AF subject to detect to person and the AF area to whole area AF, basically how the camera manual says that this is supposed to work. Then I've set the detection priority auto exposure with autofocus setting to off. In this first run, the background alone meters about 0.4 of a second, f4, ISO 1600. Now, when I step into the frame, of course, that's going to change the overall composition of the scene's brightness, and the meter now reads between 1/13 and 1/15, Now going back into the menus and turning detection priority AE with AF on results in the same metering reading of the empty background. But with me in the frame, the meter is now reading between 1/25th and 1/30th of a second. The slight but measurable change in the exposure and exposure stability with different eye detection settings suggests that the metering weight is strongly tied to the AF area and its size. The smaller AF area of the eye-sized AF point doesn't provide as consistent of a signal to the meter as the larger face size AF area does. Now, while the manual implies that detect priority auto exposure with AF only works with subject detection, in reality it works with all of the AF areas, at least that I could find. For example, you can see here that with the AF area set to 1 point and the detection priority auto exposure enabled, moving the autofocus point changes the exposure. However, when detection priority and is disabled, the exposure no longer changes based on what's under the AF point. So, with all that said, let's talk a second about how this changes the metering on the R5 Mark II and the R1. Now, stepping back to my original R5 for a moment, the camera basically operates as if detection priority auto exposure is always enabled. Metering is always biased based on what's under the autofocus point. So the change here isn't turning this on, the change is really turning this off. Now the question then is, when would you want to do that? Well, to a certain extent, turning off detection priority auto exposure turns the evaluative metering mode into a smarter version of center weighted averaging. That is, the camera is still using the whole frame, but still using the evaluative metering algorithm, but the metering algorithm is weighting everything more intelligently than just considering what's the center and what's not, which is what happens in center weighted averaging. We can see this in some simplistic testing with, again, a simulated high contrast scene. The exposure is more consistent for the whole scene, regardless of where the bright and dark areas are distributed compared to center weighted. Now, as for the question of when you should or shouldn't use this function, to my mind, the meat of that comes down to control and consistency in various scenarios. Disabling detection priority auto exposure could produce more consistent exposures in continuous shooting situations, or at least some of them. If the scene's average brightness stays relatively fixed, but the subject brightness changes relatively, between exposures or whatever, then it may be better to use the scene's average instead of the subject's weighted average for getting a stable exposure. Now, with that said, I actually think that this has something to do with video mode more than anything. And I'm starting to suspect that this was a video mode setting originally. In video mode, all of the EOS R hybrids basically just use evaluative metering, and you have no real control beyond that. Now, if you jump over to Canon's Cinema EOS OS, like you have on the R5C, there is a light metering mode setting, and it allows the user to adjust the metering algorithm between backlit, spotlit, and standard modes. Now, on the Cinema EOS cameras, the standard mode is similar to center-weighted averaging that's done, or the unweighted averaging, I should say, that's done with detection priority AE turned off. While the normal weighted metering, at least conceptually, should function similarly to what you would expect out of the backlight and spotlight modes without having to have the extra specificity since it's weighting a smaller area of the frame. So the question then is, well, if you're in video mode, when do you choose which of these options? Now, I'll be honest, I don't have a ton of personal experience with this because I tend to shoot on a solid black background, and so I want the better metering, or the more subject-weighted metering that comes with the detect priority auto exposure option being enabled. So that's what I use 90% of the time. However, if you are shooting B-roll or landscapes where there is no defined subject, that may be a place where you find that having the more intelligent full frame metering will be more useful. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.